Hey Artnerds, today we are finally getting around to field testing the Radiant watercolors. These dye-based liquid watercolors come in cute little dropper bottles. I have a selection here that I've collected over the years. I'm also going to be using a couple of the Echo line liquid watercolors as well for this field test. So this is what our finished illustration is going to look like. As you can see, very, very bright colors. I'm also augmenting this with the Core mini palette, and this is the sketch that I started out with. It was a digital sketch that I printed, used my blue line technique, penciled, stretched it, and then we're going to be watercoloring it today. So these are the materials that I'm using for today's tutorial. I'm going to be painting on Arches cold pressed cotton rag watercolor paper. I have used Radiant watercolors in the past, but I didn't like them in the past, and I'm hoping that painting on a higher quality paper today will kind of change my opinion. I'm also going to be using the Core palette because the colors are very clean and almost dye-like in terms of how clean they are, particularly the burnt sienna. And I wanted something for Kara's face and skin that wouldn't lift every time I've tried to layer it. We're also going to be using a ceramic rose palette. Radiant makes these plastic palettes. You guys might remember in my Art Supply Redemption video, I used one of those plastic palettes, but so much time has passed, I'm afraid a lot of dust has gotten into that palette. So I wanted to work with something clean and something fresh. So I'm instead working with a rose ceramic palette that my friend Kabocha sent me. The illustration that we're using for this field test has been stretched for a while, and I have tutorials here on this channel that'll show you how to stretch watercolor paper if you're interested in learning how to do that. And it's an illustration of Kara enjoying some candy. I wanted something that would really suit the bright, saturated candy colors of Radiant watercolors. Now, I do want to disclose to you guys, like I said, I've used these in the past. I've never really quite liked them. So I'm hoping today that'll change my mind. Now, these are super, super concentrated. A little bitty bit goes a long way. First thing I'm doing though is I'm just using a little bit of the burnt sienna from the Core mini palette, which I've also reviewed here on this channel, just to start painting in her skin. I'm also using just a little bit of the Echo line liquid watercolor for the very, very light blues on this illustration. So I have not reviewed the Echo line liquid watercolors as a standalone product, but I have reviewed them in conjunction with the Echo line watercolor markers, which I happen to really like for dye-based watercolor markers. So if you're interested in learning more about those, I'll link the video right here as well as down in the description below for you guys to check it out. And I'm using this really, really light blue. I believe it's sky blue. It's fairly watered down, and I think that's one of my problems with these liquid watercolors is I never water them down enough for our base color. But I'm using that to paint the white shadows on Kara's stocking and on Kara's dress. I'm also using the same color to start establishing the glass bottles. So with these watercolors, I often have problems where the colors will lift and they'll reactivate when I try to layer them, particularly on cellulose-based papers. So I figured rather than trying to glaze on top of my colors, I'm going to start by painting the glass first and then paint the candy colors inside, and hopefully the glass color will influence the colors we're painting on top of it, because these are very, very, very transparent. Since they're dye-based, there shouldn't be too many particulates, too many pigments. There should be no granulation. One of the problems I had with these though is as I'm painting it, they start to dry immediately. So for me, they're more prone to streaking than like tube or half pan based watercolors. So I've added a little bit of the Radiant Ice Blue into our Echo line, and I have here a piece of cotton rag paper that I'm using for swatching. I wanted it to be just a little darker, and I also wanted to start working with the Echo line watercolors. Now, at the time of release, the Echo line watercolors did not have a dropper top. Now they do. The Radiant watercolors have had a dropper top for as long as I can remember, and that actually makes them very handy to use in that regard. You don't have to grab another eyedropper and use that to apply your color to the palette. And just a moment ago, I did misspeak. We're using the Radiant watercolors as the primary test vehicle here. And even though I have a haircut, my hair has decided to sneak into the frame, so I apologize for that. I grabbed another one of the Echo line colors. It's a very light, I think it's like pastel red, and I'm using that just to apply the blush to her cheeks, to her lips, etc. In general, I find the Radiant watercolor color line to be very like marker colors, if you guys know what I mean. Like not any skin tones, not any flesh tones, no blush, very few sort of natural tones. So I've augmented my Radiant collection with some of the Echo line colors. Now I do wish Echo line would release empty Echo line watercolor markers, because I would love to try putting some of my Radiant watercolors in the Echo line marker bodies and have a larger collection, because I find the marker is easier for me to use than in this sort of concentrated form here. So now I've mixed a little bit of daffodil yellow with a little bit of persimmon, which is a very sort of orangey red, to get the orange that we're using for the orange slice that Kara's eating here. Now I should have watered this down quite a bit, because this is really, really saturated. When they say these are concentrated liquid watercolors, that is no joke. That's part of the reason why I'm having such a hard time getting used to them. With watercolor, you're already working with a really concentrated form that you have to water down a lot. And these, you need to water them down even more. I've got our orange painted in. Now I'm moving on to her dress. And what I really initially wanted, I think we're using raspberry or maybe cerise for her dress. I really wanted kind of a light pink for this. And even though I added what I thought was a fair amount of water, it is still super saturated and super concentrated. And that's one of my kind of problems with these for how I work. You may actually like this. This may deliver exactly what you're looking for. The colors are like day-glo saturated. They're super saturated, so it may be difficult for you to get used to it if you're used to using half pans and tubes of paint. And unlike the Hydrus watercolors, which I did an Art Supply Redemption field test, and I'll link that right here. Those are also liquid watercolors, but those are pigment-based rather than being dye-based. I don't think I can ever really get used to using the Radiant watercolors, and certainly not as a standalone thing. You're going to see me struggle throughout this video as I try to apply everything I've learned about watercolors since the last time I used these to try and like them and try to get used to them, and it just never really clicks for me. So as I'm mixing color, I'm also applying it to different objects in the background, different candies in the background, which kind of gives us a more unified palette. Since these colors are so saturated, everything is kind of the same chroma of intensity. And for me, as you guys saw at the beginning of the video, I ended up with this just really saturated piece that's kind of all the same oversaturated chroma level, which could be useful if you paint a lot of like candies or very saturated children's toys or plastic objects. But for somebody like me who paints a lot more natural things, these colors just feel unnatural and overly saturated. Now, one of the things that I actually like about these, so years ago I did a piece for a Bravest Warriors book, and it was like a seek and find book, and I did kind of a candy wonderland. Some things don't ever change, right? I'm doing candy again now. And I went with the Radiant watercolors for the majority of my color because I knew it was going to give me these like very poppy, saturated, tasty looking candy colors. At the time I did it on a cellulose paper. I believe I did it on Canson Vol. And I had a lot of problems with the colors reactivating, the colors lifting, and since they were dye-based, that makes sense. Dyes in general just tend to be both very staining, but also very prone to reactivation. So I expected that to be an issue with this piece, but on the cotton rag paper, they actually handle a lot better and they're more stable. I also want to point out that there are a lot of artists who use these watercolors to beautiful effect. I understand that these are probably just not for me and how I paint, but I don't want you guys to think that I'm just, you know, crapping on these, just dissing them. They are not necessarily a bad product, and I like a lot of Dr. P.H. Martin's products. I really like their bleed proof white. I really like the Hydrus watercolors. It's just sometimes an art supply is not necessarily for you. Now, these dye-based watercolors were originally used for like graphic reproduction art back in the time kind of before computers when you needed to do more Pantone matching. And Dr. P.H. Martin's has provided a variety of products that used to suit that, like the Spectralite liquid acrylic colors were geared towards that kind of reproduction. These are a little bit of an holdover from that time that people still really enjoy using. So that could also be another reason why I'm kind of struggling with them, is the use case is a specific use case, and what I'm using it for is not really that use case. And I just also haven't found a way to kind of make them my own. Just in general, I find other types of watercolor far easier to use and definitely more compact. For me, this is not a type of watercolor I can see myself using often because it requires kind of having everything spread out. And yeah, you can use the palettes that are covered and you can reactivate the dyes. In fact, that may be an easier way to use these. A lot of the artists I see who use these watercolors in conjunction with like their alcohol markers or with their other types of watercolor, they are working with, for the most part, a very dehydrated form, and they only reactivate just as much as they need. On that note though, if you're looking for really concentrated bright colors, these definitely deliver. They can be diluted so you can get some very light pastels, and they activate quite well with water, as you can see with the green heart-shaped gummy in the foreground. Unfortunately, these don't lift out well, and that bodes sort of well for not reactivating, not remixing, not polluting other colors, but it also makes it harder for me to adjust saturation when I find I've gone too saturated. Even trying to lift it out while it's still wet, it's very staining, and they don't really want to budge a whole lot. So color adjustment is more difficult. If you're someone who's kind of just learning watercolor and you need that forgiveness, you need that leeway, these watercolors are not going to give that to you. So you need to go in being prepared to start way more diluted than you think you're going to need to, and be prepared knowing you're not going to be able to go in and make those kind of adjustments. I know it's probably way too late in the game to suggest something like this, but it would be really interesting to see Dr. P.H. Martin's offer a more compact, travel-friendly version of these watercolors. Maybe offering like a dye-based version of this, I mean, these are dye-based, but offering like a half pan or a gel version of these that you just use a little bit of water to activate and they travel a little better. For someone like me, that might work a lot better because I can more easily control the amount of water I add to that. Plus, just having a jelly-based watercolor would be pretty cool. They've got those jelly-based gouaches, and a lot of people really like those. So, not only would it be really pretty and very picture-friendly, but it might be a little bit more user-friendly for people who are used to half-pan and tube-style watercolors. Of course, I definitely don't expect Dr. P.H. Martin to release something crazy like that. But then again, you've got Inktense, or Derwent, who released the Inktense half pans, and then Faber-Castell has recently released their own India ink-based dye pans, India ink-based half pans. So I don't know. You never know who's listening and who might decide that's a super good idea. So if you guys are looking for someone who's very proficient with these watercolors, Nashi Art is really, really good with these and makes it seem very simple. And it's not necessarily very simple. So I highly recommend you guys check out her work. So as I mentioned earlier, these watercolors don't necessarily have a lot of good earth tones. And I kind of considered augmenting with the Hydrus watercolors, since those are also made by Dr. P.H. Martin's. I thought they might play well together, and maybe I'll do that in a future video. But I decided to go with the core half pan palette because for pigment-based watercolors, they are very, very clean. In general, they have really fine granulation, and I happen to love their burnt sienna color, which is what I'm using for Kara's hair here. I also use the Payne's gray on her shoes a little bit later. It would be fun to come back into this and try to do I want to say more of a mixed media, but they're both watercolor media. An illustration where I do use the Radiant watercolors, but I'm also using the watercolor I'm more comfortable and more familiar with, and see if there's some way I can find a happy medium for myself. Something else I do like that you can't really see is on her shoes, I started with a turquoise blue. I think it's like juniper green. Turquoise, not turquoise. A turquoise blue. And then I went over it with Payne's Gray from the Core Mini Palette. And you can still see a lot of that beautiful turquoise blue influencing the Payne's Gray. So I really liked how I was able to layer the colors and they still influence one another. So if you're someone who's looking for colors, paints that can give you like a really chromatic look with a lot of different colors, and you can really layer your colors and build up that definition, but it doesn't get muddy, using these might be a good idea because you can sort of build up that color and the chroma that you want and then paint on top of it, and you're not worrying about muddying your colors or too many different pigments. So really, my major complaint with these is just they're too saturated for me to use, and the colors are a little bit synthetic, which is why I went with candy. But in general, I'm more attracted to softer colors, more earthy tones, definitely more sedimentation in my watercolors. So for me, these sort of have kind of like a synthetic or a fake feel, which is not what I'm looking for in my art. But they may be able to deliver exactly what you're looking for in your art. This doesn't make them a bad product. It just makes them not a great fit for my studio. So with these, I felt like I couldn't really do shadows the way I would have wanted to using the concentrated Radiant watercolor. So I decided to pull out my Inktense watercolor pencils and use the indigo, a little bit of the red violet, and the white to add some highlights, to add some shadows, and to just color adjust. Now, I'll go ahead and tell you guys that was a little bit of a mistake because it adds kind of a granulation to it. You get that kind of stop and go color pencil thing that works well with sedimenting watercolors. It works well with pigment-based watercolors, but it feels a little bit fake on top of dye-based watercolors. What would have been a better decision would have been to use the core watercolors to color adjust this image. I was afraid to add a lot of extra water because I was afraid to add some reactivation. I didn't mention this at the time, but applying color in some areas, let me go back. All right. So when I was applying color to areas that had already dried, sometimes it would cause a lot of spidering, like the green thread in the red cherries. Those cherries were dry. I painted in the green went everywhere. The colors also bled on some of the candy canes, and I just couldn't predict when this was going to happen because I waited for these areas to be fully dry before I applied the color. I don't know if it was a problem with the paper, if it was a problem with the paints. I've used Arch's watercolor paper a lot. It's a very popular paper for my watercolor art. I'm very familiar with it. So I don't think it was the arches. I do think it was some property in the Radiant, maybe one of the preservatives that they use that caused this unpredictable spidering. So for me, if I can't predict what my watercolors are going to do, even to the point of knowing they're going to be unpredictably bleedy, it's harder for me to use them because I don't like using art supplies I can't rely on. I do a lot of comic art. I do a lot of figurative art. I paint a lot of faces. And that's the one area you can't really afford to have a whole lot of happy accidents on, if you guys know what I mean. Once I finished up with my Inktense pencils, I went in with just a little bit of white gouache to add some more highlights. So, I want to talk about the pros and cons of the Radiant watercolors, and I want to talk to you guys about whether or not I was able to redeem these for me. So, the pros. These offer vibrant, saturated colors that are often not available in traditional pigment-based watercolor. A little bit of color goes a long way with these. These can be reactivated for continued painting, unlike the Hydrus, which reactivate really poorly. With the Hydrus, you need to basically try to get it done in one painting session or find a way to keep your paints wet. With these, you can let them evaporate and come back to them, and that may even be the better way to work with them. The colors are really, really clean because they're dye-based. They're not pigment-based, and I don't have any issue with color chromatography where when we add water, they split out into their individual dyes, which is a problem I had with the Akashia watercolor brush pins a really, really long time ago, and it's something I'm always testing for when I'm tasting. Wow, please don't taste your watercolor markers when I'm testing watercolor markers. All right, so what are the cons for these? These are going to be, for the most part, personal cons. Your mileage may vary, and if you use these and love them, I would love to see some of your work, just for inspiration. So, cons. I really struggle to use these. Maybe I should try using these with a water brush. I don't know. They are unpredictable they have unpredictable reactivatability. What a word. And unpredictable bleeding, which are just two big no-goes for me. However, again, if you're using these and these are not an issue for you, I want to hear about it. The colors are maybe too clean and they feel very synthetic. They have kind of a bubblegum pop feel, if you guys know what I mean. And I can't reliably layer, which is kind of a no-go for me and how I create art. So were they redeemed for me? No. Do I want to keep playing around with them and see if I can find a way to love them? Yeah. Am I going to do that in the near future? No. I'm moving and these create just too much. They take up too much space on my desk for me to just leave them out and play with them. They're not compact enough. So if Radiant were to release a jelly palette or, I don't know, a concentrated watercolor palette, and yes, I am familiar with the Vivi Viva color sheets and the Peerless watercolors, and those are a very close approximation of what I'm kind of looking for. I am aware of those, but if Radiant released something like that, I would definitely be interested in checking it out because it would have a smaller footprint and it would be more compact. And that's really more of what I'm looking for when I do watercolor. Because if I were to use these sort of really clean, very saturated, very synthetic colors, I'm going to want to use them in a very limited capacity. And I'm going to want them to be very easy to clean up, pick up, and put down. So that was my Art Supply Redemption review of the Dr. P.H. Martin's Radiant Watercolors. I will link my unboxing swatch, actually more like my Art Supply Redemption swatch test, down in the description below. I hope this was helpful, useful, inspiring, and informative for you guys, although it may only be useful if you have an art style very similar to mine and you tend to paint a lot of natural things. But I had fun painting this, and I had fun hanging out with you guys, and in the end, to me, that's what matters the most. If you like my art and you want to check out more of it, this cute little gal here is from my ongoing comic, 7-Inch Kara. You can read the first 6 chapters for free as a webcomic at 7inchkara.com, and I'm currently working on the Kickstarter for Volume 2, so if you want to read even more of my beautiful watercolor comic, you can check that out. I'll have links to all that down in the description below. If you just want to keep up with my art, you can do so on Instagram at instagram.com/natosoup. If you're a fellow artist, send me a message. I'll follow you back. And I generally keep up with Instagram pretty good, so there's no need to tag me every time you post art, but I would love to check out your art. And if you're looking for other artists to hang out with and chat with, you can join me on the Paint Box, my art-centric Discord server, where we share art and we geek out about art supplies all the time. If you like what I do and you want to help me continue to do it, you can join me over on Patreon at patreon.com/natosoup and get early access to videos like this one. So I want to thank you guys so much for watching. I hope to see you guys again really soon, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Bye, guys!